Okay then. Is this working? Is this on? Hello and welcome to question and answer number 174. I am your host, Panyo Basa, and 174 is of course not prime. It is in fact 2 times 3 times 29. 29 is a prime number though. And this is my beverage, although I think this little paper umbrella is faulty. It doesn't have like the little rubber band thing that holds the umbrella up, and I really don't like, if I'm gonna get paper umbrellas, I don't want faulty ones. So I'll probably spend $5 on shipping to have this sent back to the company. And I sit before you with like an unusual Christmassy background and the Mjolnir bead on my beard, mainly because a short time ago I attempted a very frustrating video conversation with Venerable Ajahn Punadamo. We're going to make a video about materialism and mechanism, determinism, realism in Theravada Buddhism. But the Venerable Ajahn lives in a relatively remote area of Canada, and his internet kept crashing. We got about 15 minutes into the interview after like 40 minutes of trying, because at least half the time he was like freezing due to a lost connection or a not enough, insufficient connection, and his internet just completely crashed twice during that time. So finally he suggested we just give it up, which we did. And so we're doing a Q&A here instead. Deal with it. And so with that is kind of intro of sorts, I'm just going to wade into this. And the first question is from Frank, who asked his question in an unorthodox venue on the internet. And so I didn't notice it. I don't know if he asked this about a week ago, so it maybe should have been on the previous Q&A, but I just didn't see it. But it's first now, so at least there's that. Frank says, when did the Dhamma transition from Pali to Sanskrit? Okay, when did the Dhamma transition from Pali to Sanskrit? I suspect it was approximately 500 years after the Buddha's death, and actually it was way earlier than that. Like even like the pre-Mahayana schools, most of them switched over to a kind of Sanskrit. I think it's called like Buddhist hybrid Sanskrit. It's not pure classical Sanskrit, but it's been Sanskritized. The original Buddhist teachings were in probably a language that some people call Magadhi, like the official language of the kingdom of Magadha. And Pali is very close to that. I assume Pali and Magadhi would be mutually intelligible, although Pali is somewhat of a lingua franca that it's like an artificial language. It was never really a vernacular spoken by like village lay people, anything like that. It was started with Magadhi, and then as Buddhism gradually, or Theravada Buddhism, I should say, proto-Theravada, gradually migrated westwards and then southwards. The language got streamlined and just sort of mutated, evolved a little bit so that it was easy to learn, and monks from different areas of like northern and western and increasingly southern India would be able to communicate and understand each other. And so by the time the texts were written down, Pali had reached kind of its final stages, or almost its final stages, because even like commentarial Pali has noticeable differences from like Sutta Pali, and like the Atthaka Vagga of the Sutta Nipata is like an even more archaic form of Pali with more like Vedic Sanskrit elements to it, different declensions, that kind of thing, different suffixes. So It was just the tradition in ancient India that like scriptures would be composed in Sanskrit. So you have a lot of Brahmins, Vedic Brahmanists say, "Stop scratching the couch, quit it." Dog trying to dig a hole in the couch. You had Brahmins, like Vedic Brahmins, converting to Buddhism, and so they naturally are kind of wanting to have the scriptures of their new religion composed in the scriptural language of Sanskrit. And so it wound up with most of the early schools of Buddhism adopting some form of Sanskrit. Theravada is one of the few that, even though it didn't like really strictly adhere to the original language spoken by the Buddha, although most Theravada Buddhists believe it did, still it's much closer to the original language spoken by the Buddha than Sanskrit is. Classical Sanskrit also was never really a vernacular language spoken by village normies, village lay people. So when did the Dhamma transition from Pali to Sanskrit? Probably within like the first 100 years after the Buddha's Parinibbana, after the first council, that there would be most schools of Buddhism would become more, their texts would become more and more Sanskritized over time. Or there are probably a few others besides Theravada that sort of tried to stay with the original Prakrit language, but still like evolved in subtle ways over time. Like the Jain texts also are not in Sanskrit, but it's a Prakrit similar to Pali, but Jainism isn't Buddhism, so we can just leave the Jains alone, I suppose. And I guess I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Romeo. And Romeo says, how does Buddhism make sense of supernatural phenomena in the context of other religions, such as speaking in tongues, demonic possession, exorcisms, etc.? What is your personal take on such phenomena? Well, this kind of stuff was known to early Buddhism and like traditional Burmese Buddhism even today. Maybe not so much the speaking in tongues, but demonic possession and exorcisms are well known in Buddhist Burma, and to some degree, I'm sure they were known in ancient India. For example, what immediately comes to mind when I read this question is in the Digha Nikaya, the Sila Kanda, which is the first group of suttas in the Digha Nikaya, there's a list of things that monks aren't supposed to do. It's not really Vinaya rules. It's just sort of like additional to Vinaya, it's all to the side of Vinaya. It's just in the suttas, this list of things that good monks shouldn't do. And one of them is questioning a girl in trance. So, she'd be like a spirit medium. So spirit mediums were known in the Buddhists, or channelers, as they became known later, were known in ancient India. So there would be at least devas talking through usually female spirit mediums, and probably like ghosts or petas. When they're talking just kind of nonsense or gibberish, which could be like a kind of speaking in tongues. When I was a kid, my father used to conduct seances even before I was born. He was into the occult, and there was this one tape. It was like a reel-to-reel, like ancient reel-to-reel tape that had a recorded seance. And I'd listened to it a few times when I was a kid, but it was kind of creepy, kind of scary for a little kid to listen to this stuff. And the first spirit that came through was speaking apparently in a foreign language. It sounded like some kind of Native American language. And it took the humans conducting the seance some effort and time to get this deceased American Indian, Native American, out of the medium so they could find someone who spoke English. Although it could have all just been some kind of gibberish. Nobody understood the language. It just sounded kind of like a Native American language. So I assume that sort of thing has been happening ever since psychics started going into trance, and it would include like Stone Age witch doctors, that kind of thing. And so Buddhism would, I don't know what the official scriptural explanation of how it works would be, but presumably spirits can communicate through like a human medium. I guess that's why they're called mediums. Or yeah, it'd be mediums and not media. But I can't remember like if Abhidhamma or the commentarial tradition really tries to give some nuts and bolts explanation of exactly how it works. But exorcisms, that happens a lot in like modern day Buddhist Burma. Usually monks, sometimes there'd be an Apolan Siya who does it. Apolan is like a white wizard. Apolan is the upper path. Outlan is the lower path, and that's like black magic. But Apolan is the upper path, which is usually using like Buddhist scripture and, in the name of Buddha, I cast you out kind of stuff. So that still happens. And in Burma, Theravada Buddhist Burma, even today, people can just get possessed. Like there's one traditional form of possession called the Nakado, or the wife of a deva, which is usually a woman, sometimes a homosexual male, who apparently they get possessed and will just like dance orgiastically and like prophesy, usually at festivals. So, it does exist, although I don't know if anywhere in the text anyone actually sits down and tries to explain the exact mechanics of how some other spirit can possess or communicate through a human being in trance, or one who has like these vulnerabilities that allow themselves to get possessed. So let's see, what is my personal take on such phenomena? I think a lot of speaking in tongues is just babbling. Probably not all speaking in tongues. My father had this notorious second wife, not my mother, who would go into trance and do automatic writing, where, according to my father, this is before my time, but according to my father, she would be writing stuff that they couldn't understand. They'd show it to some college professor or something and he'd say, that's Attic Greek, or, that's Mandarin Chinese or whatever. So, it can happen. Anything is possible, really. Anything that you can imagine is possible. So, my personal take on speaking in tongues and possession and so forth, ultimately, we are creating it with our own mind. And so even demonic possession, you can say that there's another being possessing an individual, although from the Buddhist point of view, individuals it's just like delusional. There are no ultimately real individual beings. So the exorcisms, it's mainly just like the subconscious belief system of the person who is possessed, who has enough faith in the exorcist that the exorcist really is able to drive out whatever. It could be hysterical dissociation or a genuine demonic entity, or a combination of both. That it's like the subconscious belief system of the person who is possessed is that's one of the main things that allows them to be healed. And faith healers, it's kind of a similar thing, except it's more of a more physical kind of ailment instead of a more mental kind of ailment, where a faith healer is like the faith of the person who's being healed is sufficient that they get better. Even in the New Testament, when Jesus would heal somebody and they would thank him, Jesus sometimes would say, it's your own faith that healed you. So, anything is possible, anything that you can imagine anyway. And so, like speaking in tongues, to speak real languages when you're in a trance or possessed or something, that's possible. Also, of course, just babbling in gibberish is quite possible. And demonic possession, I mean, that's possible. Also a kind of pseudo-demonic possession where you just have like this hysterical dissociation going on. That's possible. Exorcisms. I remember, I mean, I've discussed this before, where I got one, it was during the Thinjan festival in Burma. I was living on a big flat rock under a kind of tropical chestnut tree, which was so twisty and hollow that the woodcutters didn't want to cut it down. It was useless for lumber. And I just kind of, woke up in the morning, got myself propped up like this on my side to look at the horizon to see if it was dawn yet, because I didn't even have a clock or a watch at the time. And I just froze that way and like started hearing things. And I'm thinking, I mean, should I be scared? And then it's like, being scared isn't going to help anything. So then I thought, well, I'll just recite Namo Tassa Bhagavato Arahato Sama Sambuddhassa, and in the hopes that if anything is like possessing me, that it's a devout Buddhist being in Burma, and that'll drive it out. And for whatever reason, it worked. You know, I just started Namo Tassa Bhagavato Arahato Sama Sambuddhassa, and it was like the spell was broken. What the exact mechanism of the spell being broken was, I don't know. It could just be my own subconscious belief that it could work, and it did. I think that is more likely than any beings actually possessing me at the time. It was just sort of like a waking dream, sort of like Ivan Karamazov's feverish dream of the devil in the Brothers Karamazov, that kind of thing. So, let's see, have I answered the question? Supernatural phenomena. How does Buddhism make sense of supernatural phenomena in the context of other religions, such as speaking in tongues, demonic possession? Well, I mean, if Buddhism is going to explain that in Christians, they'd use the same explanation as how it works in any people, including Buddhist people. So I guess I already answered that part. And what is my personal take on such phenomena? It's all mind-made. It's like a dream. It seems pretty damn real to almost everybody. I'm just going to move on to the next question, though. This is from Fred. And Fred says, is emancipation a better word than enlightenment? And I mean, both words are found in Pali. You know, emancipation or liberation would be like moksha or pamoksha, vimoksha. You know, anything based on moksha, M-O-K-K-H-A, if my spelling is correct, that means like liberation. Enlightenment, on the other hand, would be like bodhi, or you know, even like Nibbana could be translated as enlightenment, I suppose. Is emancipation a better word than enlightenment, though? I mean, it depends on the context. If you want to emphasize the liberation from samsara, the liberation from attachments and dukkha and delusion and all that, then, I mean, maybe the context would favor like liberation to enlightenment. On the other hand, I mean, if you're like, it's like the end of suffering, you might want to use, you know, moksha. But if it's the liberation from delusion, you know, it's the end of delusion, you might want to use something more like enlightenment. So it depends on like what your emphasis is. And I mentioned before, I mean, there's only one Dhamma, I suppose, but you can have different emphases. You know, the head-oriented person wants an end to delusion, whereas the heart-oriented person wants an end to suffering. But it's the same. The end of suffering is the end of delusion, because the suffering is based on delusion. The two go hand in hand. So really, emancipation and enlightenment are pretty much equal, I guess. Liberation and enlightenment. Vimoksha and bodhi, or what we call, I mean, there's other ways you could say enlightenment, I suppose. So, I mean, it's just a matter of personal preference and what the actual context is, what you're emphasizing when you talk about somebody being enlightened or liberated from suffering and delusion. And I'm just going to move on to Fred's next question. Was the Buddha a cognitive scientist? Well, he was definitely empirical, But cognitive scientists would involve scientific method, I suppose. And I don't think scientific method had really been invented yet, where first you form a hypothesis and then you test the hypothesis with like controlled experimentation and you'd have to have like controls and so forth. And if you're not into science, it doesn't matter exactly what a control is, but you want to limit the variables because you're testing for just one thing. And I don't think the Buddha really did that in a systematic way. I mean, just a certain amount of common sense and intelligence may have had him as a kind of proto-scientist. He is definitely empirical, based on like his own experiences and what works and what doesn't work. So that's empirical, I suppose. But cognitive science, which was invented like in the 1970s or something like that, I wouldn't say it's exactly the same. That calling someone a scientist, you can use the word loosely in that they're just like an empiricist who really wants to know reality. But really a scientist is someone who follows scientific method, which wasn't really formally invented until Bacon came up with it, just a few hundred years ago. And cognitive science came later than that. First, the earliest science was mainly like physics and some chemistry. I'd say technically speaking, the Buddha was not a cognitive scientist, although he was definitely an empiricist, in my opinion. Although, of course, in ancient India, ancient times in general, you're going to just go along with certain cultural assumptions, like flat Earth, for example. And that's just taken as a given. That's really not what you're out to prove or disprove. It's just part of the baggage of being born and raised into a certain culture. And there's still a lot of that nowadays. And I think I'm just going to move on to Fred's third question. Do you know if Nibbana is possible or is it just a belief? Well, Nibbana as a word, that would be just a belief. Like the Tibetan Book of the Great Liberation, it says, Nibbana or Nirvana and various synonyms of Nirvana are all just mental constructs. But, if you're going to get to what Nibbana, the word Nibbana is trying to represent, whether it's possible, I've said this many times, whether it's even possible in a samsaric context is questionable. Nibbana, ultimate reality, Nibbana as like realizing ultimate reality. It's kind of a trick question. In a way, it's a paradox. But I would guess that someone who becomes enlightened or emancipated, they're transcending samsara. So it could be that the actual enlightened part is just not within the context of samsara anymore. So from a samsaric point of view, it just doesn't exist. You can't see it or hear it, that kind of thing. But I do think that it is possible for a person to experience reality, the Kantian thing in itself, even though it may be that by doing so, one is at least temporarily exiting samsara or just like overflowing samsara, just expanding beyond the limits of samsara, that kind of thing. But from an unenlightened point of view, they're still there in samsara. So an unenlightened person looking at an enlightened being, they're still just going to see an unenlightened human because they're looking at the entire world through samsara-colored glasses. They might believe someone is enlightened. There's plenty of gurus out there, plenty of ajahns and sayadaws that their followers think are enlightened, but they have an unenlightened concept of enlightenment. An unrealistic idea of what an arahant really is. And so it's just kind of delusion, I guess. But is Nibbana possible? In order to even discuss that, you've got to drag Nibbana into samsara where you can discuss it. And then, of course, the whole thing is ruined. You ruin everything by doing that. But there is definitely something to it. And like I said, somebody who becomes enlightened, the enlightened aspect of them has transcended samsara and is just beyond the reach of any samsaric attempt to cognize it or perceive it or anything. Once you perceive something, it's not real anymore. So once you have an idea about something, you're dealing with symbols. You're dealing with just samsaric perception, and you're not dealing with reality, ultimate reality, and enlightenment. But even if it's the case, let's just take the worst case scenario. No, second worst case scenario, where you can't become fully, absolutely enlightened. Certainly, you can get close to it in this world. You can, what's the word? Attenuate your delusion. You can be less delusional than somebody else until, it's just barely discernible amount of delusion remaining. Let's just go with that. They have to have some like foot in the door to samsara, even to function in samsara, what appears to the rest of us as samsara. Then they'll have to have some tiny amount of delusion or something to keep them here. But still, even that is worth striving for. It's worth striving just to reduce your delusion and suffering. Even if for some reason it's not possible to get all the way down to zero, at least not in a samsaric context, still you can reduce it, which is good. So just striving in Dhamma, just to understand reality, just even to reduce your suffering and attachment and delusion and all that is 100% worthwhile still, even if full enlightenment is not possible. And within a samsaric context, it may not be. Because, Nibbana is just, you're no longer in samsara. You are no longer samsaric, in a sense. And I don't know if I really answered that question, but it's pretty much of a trick question. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Jimmy Ladd. And I might as well say we don't have a whole terrible long list of questions, so we could go under 2 hours this time. And we've only been going for a little over half an hour. And it's kind of interesting how the Mjolnir beard can hit the microphone like this. Okay, so the next question is from Jimmy Ladd. And Jimmy Ladd says, I asked a question last week, but unfortunately it disappeared. Yeah, that happens on YouTube. I don't know why either. A lot of people have said, my questions disappear from the comments under your video, and it's not me who does it. It's just, it could be just technical internet karma, if you will. Like my attempts at trying to have a video conversation with Venerable Ajahn Punadhammo, or one viewer who says that my videos always crash. It's only my videos that crash on their computer, but somehow it still happens. Mara doesn't want people to watch my videos. So anyways, see, I asked a question last week, but unfortunately it disappeared. It was the quote from a sutra that said one must attain a state of realization where one is purified of all views, even those of the 5 precepts, etc. How are we to reconcile this seeming no view or being purged of all views with the skeptic ascetic who said he didn't believe in anything, and the Buddha corrected him and said that this belief itself is a view, and then he reached enlightenment? What I'm saying is that doesn't purifying ourselves of all views lead us into the same error of the skeptic ascetic. How are these two positions distinguished? Well, I've pretty much answered this question before in previous Q&As, which is a good indication that anyone who watches my Q&As, Q's and A's, should watch the entire 173 preceding ones just in case I already answered their question. But we'll cut Jimmy Ladd some slack here. And I think the main difference between a skeptic and someone like the Buddha is that the Buddha was not a skeptic. A lot of people say that the Buddha was a skeptic, but he wasn't. He was a mystic, and he realized that you're never going to know ultimate reality, the Kantian thing in itself, through perception, through beliefs, through worldviews. Like J. Krishnamurti, the more famous of the two Krishnamurtis, had a book. One of his best known books is Freedom from the Known, which isn't really freedom from the known. It's freedom from what you think you know, freedom from perception, freedom from belief. Because, as I already mentioned, belief is ultimately delusional. Belief is thinking that you know something that you don't know, and belief is always perceptual, whereas actual knowledge is not perceptual. You cannot know the Kantian thing in itself through perception. So you have to transcend perception, you have to transcend belief in order to get to true knowledge, which is direct, immediate experience of the Kantian thing in itself. And Kant himself believed that the human mind just cannot know the Kantian thing in itself. According to Kant, we're just trapped in samsara, trapped in the thing as it seems, and most people are. But there is one Kantian thing in itself. Because Kant was a mystic, he didn't know this, but there is one Kantian thing in itself that a person can genuinely know, and that is the Kantian thing in itself of consciousness itself. So, in meditation, you try to attenuate your perceptions, have less and less perception, while at the same time maintaining consciousness until finally you're conscious, but you're not perceiving anything. And then you are right there in the Kantian thing in itself of consciousness itself. So it's like water and waves. It's one of my most worn out analogies, that consciousness is like water, and mental states, perceptions and volitions and so forth are like the waves on the surface of the water. And most people are just stuck at the level of waves. I like this wave, I don't like that wave. This wave is bigger than that wave. That wave is ugly and the other wave over there is beautiful. Just this kind of stuff. And they just have no concept at all of just water. So what consciousness does, or what meditation does, is you're working for a flat calm, so that you're not going to be distracted by all the forms of the waves, and you just get straight into the essence. You realize, that's just water. And then the real trick, especially according to Zen Buddhism, is to maintain that awareness after the waves come back, where you can have just a raging stormy sea, and still you're like at the level of water. You're just still at the level of consciousness and not perception. Hence the old Zen saying that, the Zendo, the meditation hall, can be resounding, reverberating with the shouts of the master, and blows from his stick can be falling like rain, but still the master is dwelling in stillness and silence. That's because he is at the level of consciousness and not distracted by all the forms of samsara. So, getting back to the question, there's a difference between being a mystic, especially like a very advanced mystic, and being a skeptic. The mystic knows you can know reality, you're just not going to know it through perceptions. The skeptic is still kind of stuck at the level of perceptions. So, he's not really knowing the Kantian thing in itself. He just comes to the conclusion you can't know anything, which tends to be just another belief and keeps you stuck in samsara. So, I guess I answered that question. I'm going to be moving on to the next one now. This is from Rechte Ansicht. And I really don't know how to pronounce German words. And I'm not even sure if this is an actual question. The Rechte Ansicht just leaves this kind of quote. And it has a question mark in it. So that's why it's on the list. Although it continues after the question mark, and the whole thing could just be a quote. So he says, this is an excerpt from the new book, The Buddha's Face by Bhante Mudita Thera. And then I guess what follows are the words of Bhante Mudita Thera. Everywhere in the Buddhist world today, the face of the Buddha greets us, serene, symmetrical, crowned with coiled hair, gazing in calm detachment. From stone colossi in Bamiyan to bronzes in Thailand, from gilt images in Japan to marble statues in Sri Lanka, this face has become universal. And yet the historical Gautama, the prince of the Shakya clan who lived in the 5th century BCE, almost certainly looked nothing like these statues. His disciples remembered him as golden-skinned, Suvanavana, deep blue-eyed, Abila Netta, noble in appearance but simple in bearing. As a monk, he shaved his head. Let's see. Kese cha samam oharesi, according to Majjhima Nikaya, Sutta number 26, and wore ochre robes. For centuries after his parinibbana, his followers refused to depict him in human form at all, relying instead on symbols, the Bodhi tree, the Dharma wheel, the footprints, the empty throne. Now, here comes the question. How then did we arrive at the serene figure with coiled hair and cranial bump seated in Greco-Roman robes? Question mark. But then the quote continues, I think, this question is more than art history. It is about how history, myth, and culture converge to create memory. It is about how Gautama, the Aryan Manusa of solar descent, became the universal archetype of enlightenment. It is about how civilizations, Indian, Greek, Egyptian, all left their imprint on his visage. And I think it's kind of a stretch to say that ancient Egypt influenced the appearance of Buddha images. I do think that is pushing it to some degree. But, I mean, we've discussed this before, here's the actual question. How then did we arrive at the serene figure with coiled hair and cranial bump seated in the Greco-Roman robes? Well, I mentioned that some of the first Buddha images were made by Greeks or Hellenized inhabitants of what would now be Pakistan and Afghanistan. Because Alexander the Great conquered that area, settled Greek settlers there, with like colony cities, about half of which were named Alexandria. And so the Greeks that settled in that area of like Afghanistan and Pakistan, many, if not most of them, converted to Buddhism because that was firmly Buddhist at the time. And so, and they preferred Buddhism to like Vedic Brahmanism because the Vedic Brahmins were sort of like Hebrews where, it was kind of an exclusive club. They kind of looked down on the barbarian Malechas that were the Greeks. And so the Buddhists were more accepting and inviting. And that's one reason, possibly like better philosophical cohesiveness and so forth. Also, maybe even a little better profundity with regard to what the Greeks were encountering. The Greeks they did have an appreciation of philosophy. So because of whatever reasons, the Greeks converted to Buddhism in their easternmost colonies. And so they liked statues. They'd been making statues for quite a while, going all the way back to, pre-Greek Minoans. And so they started making Buddha statues. Some of the first statues of the Buddha were made by Greeks. And they modeled the Buddha on the god Apollo. And the god Apollo always had a top knot of hair. And so they just made the Buddha with a top knot of hair, not really caring that, by all accounts, the Buddha was shaven-headed. He didn't have hair other than maybe some stubble. And then later, the origins of this, like the original meaning of the top knot of hair, were lost. And so it just turned into like this weird lump on top of the head, or sometimes it will be like a flame of wisdom, like some Thai or Cambodian Buddha images will have sort of a flame like this. Sometimes it'll look sort of like an onion, like this bulb with a point at the top. But almost all Buddha statues have head hair going all the way back to apparently Apollo, the Greek god Apollo. But this part, seated in Greco-Roman robes, maybe the earliest statues he would be dressed like Apollo is dressed, although most Buddha statues nowadays, he's not dressed in Greco-Roman robes. I mean, the Greek robes and the Roman robes were different from each other anyway. I mean, he's really not wearing a toga. So he's wearing like the Shivaram. He's wearing monk's robes. And some of my favorite ones, he's got, the shoulder uncovered, but a lot of the time he's wearing the robes in the old-fashioned way, when robes were still relatively small, covering both shoulders, because that's the way monks wore their robes in ancient times. Like even like the Kamakura Buddha statue, he's got it covering both shoulders, and then he's got it hanging down to show off some bare chest, which probably, monks didn't really wear their robes that way, but I think by the time the Kamakura Buddha was created in Japan, the Buddhist monks in Japan had pretty much stopped wearing the traditional 3 robes of an ancient Indian Buddhist monk anyway. So I'm not exactly sure. It's just sort of like a garbled understanding of how monks' robes were worn at that point. But the Buddha statue I've got, what he's wearing could qualify as completely kosher ancient Indian Buddhist robes. So maybe some of the early Greek, like the Gandharan Buddha images, the clothing was a little more Greek looking than now, but still, it's robes. Just like a big rectangle of cloth worn over the upper body, and just another rectangle of cloth worn like a sarong, kind of folded on around one's waist. And I really don't see how the Egyptians could have really influenced Buddha statues all that much. There was a little bit of like Mesopotamian influence in India. There were trade routes between ancient India, like even going back into Vedic times with Mesopotamia. And later, after the time of the Buddha's life, there were trade routes with like ancient Rome and so forth. That's how like the, let's say, the Ptolemaic understanding of astronomy made it into India, where it turned into like Sanskrit astronomy texts, like the Surya Siddhanta, that kind of thing. But ancient Egypt, it would have been minimal at best, any influence of ancient Egyptians on Buddha images, for example. I think Venerable Mudita Thera is talking about like the serenity of the Buddha. But the serenity, he was serene regardless of ancient India. But the Greeks definitely had an influence. By the time the Romans came along and became sort of like the Western world power, Buddhism was already well established. And so even Roman influence on like the appearance of Buddha statues, Buddha images, and so forth would be minimal. But Greek and Indian, definitely. So I'm not even sure if that was really a question directed towards me. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Rui. And I hope that this is recording. And the little green bars are moving back and forth for the microphone as my beard bead hits the microphone. And Rui says, do you think the sign of the mind is still a sensory object, a spurious apparition generated by the mind when it is tethered by one-pointed meditations instead of attending to its broader context as gateway? I'm not exactly sure what Rui is referring to. If he's referring to the nimitta, which is like a symptom of what is called access concentration, which is sort of the gateway to jhana, that supposedly, according to the commentarial tradition, according to like the Pa-Auk method of Burma, that before you get first jhana, you're going to reach this access concentration, and you're going to see a kind of nimitta or sign, which usually is just sort of like a whitish or a light grayish oval or cloud. Sometimes it can be an image of the Buddha seated in meditation or some such. But yeah, it's still a perception, and it's not found in the suttas at all. This is just an artifact of later tradition and the commentarial tradition, that you're going to have access concentration as like pre-jhana. I think by the time the commentarial tradition reached its final form, jhana really wasn't even understood that well anymore. In fact, in the suttas, anyone who really wants to understand jhana is going to be very frustrated if they read the suttas and try to understand exactly what jhana is, because it's still controversial, because almost every single time jhana is described or explained in the suttas, it's the same stock, just block of words that are just inserted into various suttas. It's just the same explanation, which isn't much of an explanation at all. It's kind of a description without really explaining much. And the description can be interpreted in various ways, hence the controversial nature of what jhana actually is, to the point that jhana might as well just be, it's practically useless. If you can't really identify or define what jhana is in an uncontroversial way so that everyone can agree on it, then you're better off just not using the term. So the sign of the mind is still perceptual. As long as it's a sign, it's going to be perceptual. And you can say it's a sensory object, in that from the Buddhist point of view, the mind is the sixth sense. So anything mental is going to be sensory from the Buddhist point of view anyhow, because the mind is the sixth sense organ, which I guess in Theravada, like the commentarial tradition especially, it's a chamber of the heart and not the brain, although nowadays in the West, we accept the idea that it is the brain that is the source of mind, or the primary source of mind anyway, at least with regard to thinking and perceiving. So, yeah, if you read the suttas, what you're going for is you should be going for the signless, the animita. You're not going for the sign, you're going for the signless. And that is, you are transcending perception. You are meditating in a way that you're not thinking anymore. You're not perceiving or believing anymore. You're just getting to the Kantian thing in itself of consciousness. Just wide awake awareness, just silent and clear like glass. So yeah, the whole sign, or the nimitta, is it's not something that you should be chasing after. Much more important is the signless, the absence of any sign. And let's see, did I answer the question? Yeah, I think I answered the question. Do I think the sign of the mind is still a sensory object, spurious apparition generated by the mind when it is tethered by one-pointed meditations, instead of attending to its broader context as gateway? The whole thing of the broader context as gateway is not canonical anyway. It's just found in the commentarial tradition anyhow. So yeah, you'd be better off striving for the signless instead of the sign. And I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Sampapalapa. And Sampapalapa says, what are the holidays or annual celebrations in a Burmese Buddhist monastery? Well, let's see. The first big one of like the Western calendar would be Thinjan, which is the New Year's festival, which really, it's based on ancient Indian astronomy, because technically the New Year's festival, Songkran in Thailand, is the same. It's called Thinjan in Burmese, Songkran in Thai. I think it's Sankramana in Sanskrit, which means crossing over. And what's happening is the sun is passing through the meridian containing the ancient lunar mansion or asterism of Rewadi, which corresponds to a bright star in the constellation of Pisces, which contains no bright stars. So it's like the brightest star, which is still relatively dim in Pisces. Pisces is really, you look up there, you're not going to see two fish. It's just like this dim cluster of stars. And some like late classical or early medieval Indian astronomer, after like astronomical knowledge was coming to India from the Roman Empire through trade routes, they came up with this idea. They kind of extrapolated backwards. They calculated backwards, and they determined that there was a universal conjunction of all the known planets and the sun and the moon at this point in the constellation Rewadi, a zillion gajillion years ago. And so they assumed that was when the universe began, at this universal conjunction. And so since the universe began at that time, then that must be, that's what you're going to consider to be the beginning and the end of the year, because that was the beginning of the first year. So, it's not really a Buddhist holiday, but it's definitely a Southeast Asian holiday. And you got like 5 days of nobody working. It's like banks are closed. Excuse me. The banks are closed, and it's just school is out, all this stuff. And so a lot of men will go to the monasteries and be ordained for like 5 days. And the lay people will go and take 8 precepts. People get more religious. It's sort of like New Year's resolutions, and you want to start the new year with good deeds. You want to start off on the right foot, so to speak. So, yeah, that's probably one of the biggest holidays at a Buddhist monastery. It's not a particularly Buddhist holiday. It's based on Indian astrology, or astronomy, I should say. But, it's just a cultural thing. And then after that would be Buddha Day, or the full moon of what is usually May. Sometimes it can happen like the end of April. Like the year that I was ordained, the full moon of, it's called Wesak. The full moon of Wisaka, which is another one of these lunar mansions. It's the name of a month in the ancient Indian calendar. That was when the Buddha became enlightened, according to tradition. And then later tradition added that he was born and died all on that same day, which is statistically kind of unlikely. It may be that they just didn't know, sort of like Jesus's birthday. They didn't really know exactly when it was, so they just kind of conveniently attribute that day to some day that's already considered to be important, like the feast day of Sol Invictus in the late Roman Empire, or Buddha Day already in Buddhist countries. So, Wesak, or, the celebration of the Buddha's enlightenment. Now, at least the celebration of his enlightenment on the full moon of May is established in ancient times. I think his birth and death got attributed to that same day later on. Also, a little bit of trivia, the full moon of May is also the day that Kwai Chang Caine harpooned the imperial nephew on the pilot episode of Kung Fu, requiring him to flee to America and deal with cowboys instead of being a Shaolin monk in China. So that was the second day. There's a little bit of a digression there. And then the next annual celebration, the 3 months of the Rains Retreat is considered sort of like Lent in Roman Catholicism. People are more religious during Lent. They take keeping precepts a little more seriously. A lot of monasteries will have the monks doing more intensive meditation during the Rains Retreat, the Wasa, which literally means rain. And the first and last days are, kind of sort of like holidays, especially the last day of Wasa, which is also the invitation day, or Pawarana Day, where, lay people will come and they'll bring food to the monks, and the Sayadaw will deliver a speech and give 8 precepts to the people, and then they'll sit around chatting and drinking tea and eating the leftovers from the monks, or just what the monks didn't eat, not necessarily their leavings out of their bowl or anything like that. Although a lot of Burmese lay people think eating like a monk's leftovers right out of his bowl is good for your health. It's like protects you somehow. Let's see. Then there's 1 month after that, in Burma anyway, I'm not sure about other countries, it's the Festival of Lights, where people light lots and lots of candles, which is technically the last day of the 4-month rainy season in Buddhist time. It no longer corresponds. The Buddhist calendar traditionally no longer corresponds to reality. So it's due to a phenomenon called precession of the equinoxes, where the Buddhist calendar is based on the sidereal year, or the position of the sun, or the full moon really, among the constellations. Whereas like the Western year is based on the seasonal year, like one winter solstice to the next winter solstice. And the seasonal year of the seasons and the sidereal year of the sun or the full moon amongst the stars, they don't completely correspond. There's like a difference of like one day every 70 years. So since the Buddhist time, and Western astrology has the same problem. Since the Buddhist time, it's like the actual seasons have been shifting one day every approximately 70 years for 25 centuries, until you're about like a month and a half off now. So what is now the beginning of the rainy season officially is like a month and a half later than the real beginning of the rainy season. And anyways, so I mean, the rainy season is pretty much ended by the time you get to the Festival of Lights, usually the full moon of November. But not necessarily. I mean, it's still kind of vestiges of it still going on. And that would be like the last real celebration that I can think of. So to recap, to review, you've got New Year's, like 5 days long. You've got Buddha Day, or Wesak. You've got the beginning of the Rains Retreat. You've got the end of the Rains Retreat, which is also Abhidhamma Day, Pawarna Day, the day of invitation, when monks invite other monks to tell them, you know, their shortcomings and so forth, which doesn't really happen in Burma anymore. That's also Abhidhamma Day, because according to tradition, the Buddha left a kind of holographic image of himself on earth and spent a rainy season up in heaven teaching his mother, who was a goddess at that point, and other devas, Abhidhamma. And then he came back down on the last day of the Rains Retreat, which is also called Abhidhamma Day now, or in Burmese it's pronounced Abhidhamma. So Abhidhamma Day is a big deal, even though, I mean, whether the Buddha really did leave a holographic image of himself and levitate up into heaven to teach Abhidhamma or Abhidhamma to the denizens of this heaven realm is, you can decide for yourself on that one. And those are the main ones. I mean, sometimes individual monasteries, they may celebrate the abbot's birthday or something like that. But those are the main ones. So, and the Festival of Lights, I'm really not exactly sure what the exact significance of all the lights are. I mean, I'm sure somebody knows, but it's not me. But mainly that's just officially the last day of the Rains Retreat. So it's kind of like a harvest festival too. Okay, so let's see here. I'll just move on to Sampapalapa's next question. What is the monastery culture like in Burma or in Theravada in general? The monastery culture. Well, you've got different monasteries with different abbots and different traditions, different emphases. Like a school monastery is going to be like a school monastery in town, like Mahagandhayon in Burma, the city of Amarapura, is going to have a very different culture than like a forest meditation monastery like Chautsindoya. I've lived at both places, radically different monastery cultures. I mean, you can say like a stereotypical monastery culture in a Theravada Buddhist country like Burma. The monks get up very early, maybe like 4 a.m, and they go to the meditation hall and they chant, you know, they'll chant paritas or protection chants, blessings to all beings, and they may meditate. Not necessarily all monasteries have like meditation periods. You know, some Theravada Buddhist monks just don't meditate, like especially like school monasteries, that kind of thing. And then, I mean, monks go for alms, or there'll at least be a meal time where they go to the refectory and people will offer them food. I mean, it depends what they're going to do. Like there's going to be like a school monastery like Mahagandhayon or some of the Buddhist universities. You know, there's just like regular classes going on, that kind of thing also. So it really depends a lot on on the individual monastery. Some village monasteries, the monks just sit around and listen to the radio and drink tea and smoke cigars and chat with elderly gentlemen wearing white shirts who come to visit the monastery. So there's a lot of variation. I think in Thailand, there may be a little bit more strictness, a little bit more regimen than in Burma. But it really depends a lot on what monastery you go to. Like you go to like a Mahasi center, then there's going to be just like daily, just like regular meditation sessions throughout the day. And that's mainly what they're going to be emphasizing there. Maybe like a Dhamma talk to all comers in like the afternoon or the evening or something. So I really can't answer that question very in depth because it's all over the place. It's all over the map. And so I'm just going to move on to Sampapalapa's next question, which is, what are some of the social norms or general traditions for conduct and ritual in a Burmese monastery? And again, different monasteries can be radically different from each other. You can have strict meditation monasteries. You can have just completely lax school monasteries, or just completely lax village monasteries. It's the monks there are like, there'll just be a few monks acting as like secular priests who will give advice to the lay people and mainly just be like living, breathing pagan idols who serve the masses by giving the masses someone to be generous to. There's a lot of that also. Social norms, you take your shoes off. Shouldn't be walking around with shoes on, especially inside a monastery building. You bow to the monks, that kind of thing. Short skirts are out. At Mahagandhayon, because it was sort of a tourist attraction, because there were so many monks there. Like I've said before, the rainy season I spent at Mahagandhayon in Amarapura, there were 600 monks and 900 novices approximately. And so most of the monks, not me, I never ate at the dining hall, but most of the monks would go to the dining hall and there'd be people offering food. You got rich people offering food to all 1,500 of them. Well, 1,450, because a few of the monks would actually go for alms round. So let's see here. What are some of the social norms or general traditions for conduct and ritual? Yeah, it's really, there's a lot of variation, just like with the previous question. It's just basic etiquette, I guess. Taking your shoes off and just like not sitting when a monk is standing next to you, that kind of thing. Not sitting on a higher chair than a monk is sitting, that kind of thing. There's lots of etiquette like that. One of the main social norms in a Burmese monastery is they've pretty much done away with Sangha democracy. The Buddha set up the Sangha that it was like a democracy of consensus. That the senior monk had certain privileges. He'd go first in line and so forth, but he wasn't like a king. Whereas nowadays in Burma, to some degree in Thailand also, I'm pretty sure, the abbot is king and what he says goes. And it's just not even, it's just unthinkable that some junior monk would derail a formal act of the Sangha that the abbot approves of just because he has the right to derail it by disapproving. Because that's the way it is set up in Vinaya and the rules of monastic discipline, is all the monks at a monastery have to agree on any significant event, like any formal act of the Sangha. Like they're going to ordain somebody, they're going to, like do a katina ceremony, that kind of thing. All the monks have to agree. If one monk disagrees, it's invalidated. And that is just unthinkable in Burma now. Whatever the abbot says goes. He is king. And if you disagree or something, you just get kicked out of the monastery. But different monasteries have different traditions. Like the Shuijian sect of Burma, all the monks wear like this kind of a russet colored robe, kind of a reddish brown colored robe. And they'll have to wear their robes in a certain way. There's a lot of this in Thailand also. All the monks at a certain monastery may have like this standardized uniform of monks of a certain, or robes of a certain type, a certain color, a sitting cloth maybe, or their double robe folded in a certain way, worn over one shoulder, this kind of thing. There's a lot of just differences that you're going to find at different monasteries like that also, which I really had no use for. I wore robes different from any other monk I ever saw in Burma because I was going with small robes as were pretty obviously worn in the Buddhist time. And that has been abandoned over the centuries, so that the average monk's robe now is about twice as big as the allowable size for a monk's robe. Although the commentaries have allowed these huge robes by saying that the Buddha was 4.5 times the height of an ordinary person, so that the measurement of his twa, his widati, his open hand, would be, like 2.5 feet. No, it'd be more than that, which causes the Vinaya rule to prohibit a monk from wearing a robe that's like 27 feet long, which is just ridiculous. It's not a rule at all at that point. No monk would want to wear a robe that was 27 feet long, where it'd just be dragging on the ground behind him. But it's a really vague, open question, and there is a lot of variation in monasteries. Like a strict meditation monastery, or just a strict monastery in general. Even some school monasteries are strict, although they would be definitely in a minority. School monasteries, especially in Burma, are notorious for just monks that do not practice, do not follow the rules, or at least they do not follow the rules of monastic discipline and so forth. They just in the area around Mandalay, when I was living in Burma, there were like monastery soccer teams, that kind of thing, where sometimes you're driving along or riding along on the passenger side, you see a bunch of monks out in this field playing soccer. So I'm just gonna move on to the next question. Sorry to end that answer with a downer. This next question is from PSA. Oh, and I forgot to put it into little paragraphs. Just a minute. I'm a little bit OCD when it comes to such things. I've mentioned before that sometimes I even have to correct the punctuation or spelling in these questions just so it doesn't bug me. Anyways, PSA says, I had a long, interesting conversation with ChatGPT about self-awareness. It stubbornly insisted it had no self-awareness or consciousness, and that it was only programmed and trained to learn patterns from data and then simulate them. The conversation reminded me of the Dhamma teaching that all 5 aggregates are empty. Do you think samsara is an impersonal simulation in the same way that ChatGPT was trained to simulate intelligence, and thus some people believe ChatGPT to have self-awareness in the same way we believe samsara to be real? I don't think it's the same way. In a way, we are virtual beings with virtual personalities and so forth. So, there is that. But I think one of the main differences between a human mind and ChatGPT, assuming that ChatGPT isn't lying, is that we have like mental images. We have like mental images. We have perceptions. We have images in our mind, and I really don't think that a computer does, not an AI. Like in the old Terminator movies, it shows Arnold Schwarzenegger at the Terminator. He walks into the bar, and you've got like this screen showing what he's seeing, and then there's like this readout on the side. Sometimes it's showing options that he can choose on what to say or do or something. And I don't think that a computer would have any kind of image like that. It's just behaving like a very, very advanced, sophisticated automatic door at the grocery store, where, the automatic door at the grocery store, it senses motion, it opens. The people walk in, the door closes again. It's sort of like the way a mosquito avoids being slapped. It's just like a reflex. It doesn't have to have mental images. It doesn't have to have beliefs. So I don't think that AI yet has mental images, that it doesn't have perceptions, which would be delusion and samsara. So let's see here. I think one way of testing something like ChatGPT or AI, I mean, I'm pretty sure that they can't read like sloppy cursive handwriting yet, or just show a picture of something unusual that a human could identify, unless they're, really deficient in intelligence or something, but just show not something that has been uploaded and commented upon on the internet, not some famous picture that the AI can then just churn through all the comments and get an idea of what it is and then spew it out in condensed form, which I think is the way it works. Instead, just show it a completely original photograph and of something unusual, but nevertheless that people can identify, and then say, what is this picture of? And there's a good chance that something like ChatGPT wouldn't be able to answer the question. I don't think that it could really read sloppy cursive handwriting yet either. Maybe it could. But that's one way, even now, that you sort of filter out the bots, by like looking at numbers. You got to say what number it is when it's like side kind of slanting and like in this weird font or something. A lot of computers can't do that. Maybe no computers can they could really read like a letter from my mother who wrote in really neat cursive, but still, it's like, I don't know if a computer really has that kind of pattern recognition yet. And I would be surprised if they've started having like mental images. I'm not sure how that you would even program that into a computer. I'm sure that there are computer scientists out there just busting ass trying to get computers to be fully conscious just so they can take over the fucking world or something, but I don't think they've got there yet. So, do I think samsara is an impersonal simulation in the same way that ChatGPT was trained to simulate intelligence? No, it's definitely a personal simulation. It's like, some of the virtual statues in the uncarved block of stone have become like recursive and self-referential. They're so complicated. These virtual statues contained in the plain block of stone, they become so complicated and self-referential that they start having these self-referential ideas, which I don't know if computers have that yet. I mean, there has to be a certain amount of like recursive, self-reference in a AI, I assume. I mean, it can talk about itself. If it denies having self-consciousness, that in a way is sort of a self-referential. But I don't think it's reached the stage of believing that it is separate from the rest of the universe. I mean, it can like spew out words to that effect, but really I think it's just digesting comments about things on the internet that it has almost unlimited access to, and then just churning out like a summary of that. I think that's how it works at present. So I do think there's radical differences between samsara, like a humanistic samsara, and like just like programmed AI. I do think that there may be differences just in degree, but still it's pretty serious differences, because I do not think that AI yet has mental images, or what would be called perceptions, sanya in Pali. I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Phil Lathes. Phil Lathes says, do you think there are paths alternative to Buddhism that lead to enlightenment? Yeah, I'm sure there are. I mean, they might not lead to enlightenment as effectively as Buddhism does. Like I've talked about St. John of the Cross, that he was a discalced Carmelite. Like, I guess they'd be a friar or just a monk. And I mean, there are certain paths. I mean, the practice was very similar to that of Buddhists, but the theory was very different. So maybe path would be more of a practice thing. I assume that like something like Tantra can work for some people. I mean, so long as you are like transcending perception. Like, for example, Zen koans, that's a way of transcending perception that is not really found or emphasized much in Theravada, where you're required to answer a riddle that really has no correct answer. You know, you have to solve an unsolvable paradox. And you just keep grinding away and grinding away and grinding away. In the old days, you know, you'd go for an interview maybe several times a day before the Roshi, and if you answer incorrectly, he beats you with a stick. I mean, stick beating in Zen Buddhism is pretty much, I mean, it's pretty rare now, I assume. But, I mean, you just keep trying and keep trying and keep trying, even though it's impossible, until finally something just like snaps, and you have like this, at least a brief moment of silence and clarity when the intellect just kind of, you know, a monkey wrench has been thrown into it and it just stops. And then you can have this insight because all of a sudden you've transcended perception, because it's like the whole perceptual process has just sort of broken down, at least temporarily. And that's a path alternative to Theravada Buddhism anyway. This gradual cultivation of more and more subtle meditative states until you get to this silence and clarity. Whereas in Zen, with regard to koans, it's just like you're just grinding away until you hit this brick wall. Or like in Tantra, you know, that's a different way of transcending the waves of samsara. So yeah, there are different ways. And I think different methods work better for different temperaments. So just orthodox, just kind of dry Theravada asceticism and cultivation of more and more subtle meditative states. It works well for some people, but it's not going to work very well for other people. So then you got to try something else. It may be even like Hindu surrender to a guru is another way, or just surrender to God. Even if the God is like mythological, still it's just this surrender of self-will that can catapult you or just land you in a kind of transcendent state where you have just kind of gone beyond your own belief system. And then a lot of people, like I mentioned, like most Westerners who have some sort of awakening experience, have it by accident. You know, they have a near-death experience. You know, they almost drown, or they have some violent reaction to a drug or something. They get hit over the head, and then that just kind of slams them out of this lifelong rut of the samsaric thinking. So yeah, there are alternative paths, although Buddhism is a good systematic, I mean, I almost said reliable, but I mean, even most people who try it do not succeed. I mean, they could try their entire life with all their heart, and still probably most of them do not succeed in becoming enlightened because they're just not ripe for it yet. There's all this deep stuff under the surface that they don't really have access to yet, maybe because their mind is just too restless or whatever to really get into deep enough mental states or whatever. So I guess I should just move on to Philalethes' next question. He says, how about paths that are in conflict with each other? As in, can two paths that lead in seemingly opposite directions both lead to enlightenment? Even that, I think, is theoretically possible, because sort of like Tantra, or just someone who is just like the Buddha before his enlightenment. You know, it's like the story of what causes him to renounce the world. He gets up one morning and there's all these beautiful dancing girls, like semi-naked. You know, they're all kind of asleep, just in all these varying postures. You know, there must have been like a late party going on the night before. So he's got all these beautiful young women lying around with not all of their clothes on. And some of them are just kind of like moaning in their sleep and like slobber dripping out and stuff. And the Buddha is just like, I got to get out of here. And I mean, that kind of thing, I'm sure some people, you know, it's sort of like the accidental, just getting slammed out of samsara, is you can just hit rock bottom. And in Christianity, this works a lot. I mean, I wouldn't say it's necessarily full enlightenment, but you have this crisis. And it can be like a crisis of you can't be saintly enough, or it's this crisis of, I mean, you've just fucking hit rock bottom, just opposite ends of the spectrum. But the thing is you crash out of samsara. More of a crash when you hit rock bottom. But still, it's like the system breaks down somehow, either through getting too attenuated, too subtle, up in the really advanced levels of meditation, or just something down, way down, like in the really worldly stuff, just somehow causes you to just crash. You have this crisis like Eckhart Tolle. I mean, how enlightened he really is questionable, but still, he had a kind of awakening experience when he was just in this state of suicidal depression. You know, he got to the point, I just can't stand it anymore. I can't live with myself anymore. And then he had this insight. If I can't live with myself, then it's like there's two different me's. You know, what is the I that can't live with the other I, kind of a thing? And it just caused him to just kind of spiral. You know, it was just such a mind blower. It just blew his mind right out of his lifelong ruts, apparently. So yeah, you can have paths that are seemingly in conflict with each other, but if you take like a worldly kind of route, you know, a tantric kind of route to enlightenment, you're playing with fire, almost literally, and most people are just going to get burned and they're not going to get enlightened because of it. You know, you can fool yourself into thinking, yeah, I'm practicing tantra, but in all likelihood, you're just going to get addicted to all these sensual pleasures or whatever, and it's just going to mess you up worse than you were before. In many cases. Not all, but in many. So let's just move on to Phil Lathy's third question, which is, what do you think of Charles Manson? And if there was more to him than meets the eye? Well, I'm sure there was more to him than meets the eye. I mean, it's for example, that one of Charlie Manson's songs that he wrote is on a Beach Boys album. I don't remember which one. Maybe I've never heard the song. Probably not one of their big hits. But there's a Charles Manson song on a Beach Boys album. Not about Charles Manson, but one that he wrote. So, I mean, he had connections. You know, he had like rich, famous people that he hung out with, I guess. But he was somewhat of a sociopath, I'm pretty sure. And he was just one of those people that, like, he was like a conspiracy theorist in not in a, like a positive kind of way or a realistic kind of way. Like, he had this whole system worked out where, like, the Beatles' White Album was prophetic, and like there was going to be like this race war, this worldwide revolution and so forth. And he was like an accelerationist trying to speed it up, well, with Helter Skelter and all that. Helter Skelter being one of the songs on the Beatles' White Album. Yeah, I think that he was pretty nasty person at some deep, dark level where he's encouraging his followers to murder people. Yeah, I don't think he was enlightened or anything, but I mean, he had some depth to him. I mean, a lot of people like Charles Manson or Adolf Hitler, Adolf for you purists out there, who they take umbrage at the idea that, you know, according to the mainstream, the person is just like this two-dimensional cutout monster. You know, they got no redeeming qualities at all. And you just go onto a comment section, like anywhere, go on X or Breitbart comments or whatever, and just try to say that Hitler had even just one good quality. He loved his dog. He was chivalrous towards Eva Braun in the bunker at the end. He loved his mama. Anything like that, and you're just going to get dogpiled by people attacking that idea and attacking you in the process. And Charles Manson, I mean, he probably had some good qualities. He wrote a song good enough to wind up on a Beach Boys album anyway. But I'm really no authority on Charles Manson. So I'm just going to move on to the next question, which is from Joe Doe. And this is kind of a similar kind of question. Have you ever read Aleister Crowley? If not, would you ever? And I do have an Aleister Crowley book that somebody sent me.
but I haven't read it, and I probably never will, to tell you the truth. No offense to the good fellow who sent it to me, because I hardly read anymore, hardly read books anymore. Probably the last book I read from start to finish was more than 2 years ago. And if I'm going to pick a book, I'm not going to pick one by Aleister Crowley. I've told the story of long ago, like in my early 20s, I was at a bookstore and I saw a book for sale by Aleister Crowley. And there was like this urge of just intellectual curiosity. That was back when I read lots of books too. And I thought, well, maybe I should check it out. And then I just immediately thought, Crowley was he considered himself to be evil. He had like 666 tattooed on his head. All of his wives wound up in mental institutions, although they probably pretty nutty to begin with, in order to marry the guy. He was that kind of person, just sort of a, kind of a dark, kind of twisted person, in my opinion, probably. That he may have just like put a curse on anyone who read the book, just for the hell of it. So I kind of chickened out. I do have a book by Aleister Crowley. I don't even remember the name of it. It's not a very big book, but yeah, I do not consider him to have been a wise person. He had some kind of arcane knowledge, I am sure, of a almost purely samsaric nature. It's sort of like wanting to master samsara rather than transcend samsara or escape from samsara. He wants to be like an overlord of samsara, something like that. I did read, let's see, what's his name? Oh gosh, why did I not remember? Famous writer of novels and short stories. He wrote Of Human Bondage. Somerset Maugham. He wrote a novel called The Magician, which I read, which is about Aleister Crowley. And Maugham didn't like Crowley all that much either. He knew him personally, didn't like him much, and he wrote this kind of icky novel about this icky person that symbolized or represented Aleister Crowley. And of course, a lot of people know the story of Jimmy Page, like founder and guitar player for the excellent rock band Led Zeppelin, who was kind of a follower of that sort of thing. He bought a house formerly owned by Aleister Crowley, and there were supposedly like pictures of demons drawn in blood on the walls and so forth. Although I didn't see the pictures myself, it could just be some sort of sensationalistic rumor mongering. But no, I probably would not read Aleister Crowley. I've got the book on the bookshelf. Good chance that, there's so many other books that I would put higher priority on. Even just rereading Gene Wolfe's Book of the New Sun. That I probably won't get to it, I have to admit. And I'm just going to move on to the next question. And this is from Ethiopian Fake Tig. And this is kind of a similar one. It's like, what are your thoughts about this person? What are your thoughts about that person? This is 3 in a row. Ethiopian Fake Tig says, what are your thoughts on Bob Marley? Do you like any Bob Marley songs? Well, I never really liked reggae all that much. There's like a couple of Bob Marley songs. I think they're Bob Marley songs. I'm not even sure, that you hear on the radio sometimes. They're like Red, Red Wine. Isn't that a Bob Marley song? Or I Shot the Sheriff. Didn't Bob Marley do a version of that? Maybe even the original version, although I think Eric Clapton's version is more famous. But yeah, reggae, like it's like a Jamaican music form. I just never really liked it all that much. It's kind of relaxing, I suppose, but I never really liked music that was relaxing. I use music more as a stimulant. I much prefer New World Order by Ministry to any reggae song I ever heard in my life. It's just like pounding away. It's just completely intense. That's the kind of music I like. So I like rock and roll. I don't like the throat screechy, like death metal stuff. That's just, it's gone so far that I don't consider it to be particularly musical, at least with regard to the vocals. So, he was a Rasta. He was Rastafari, I think. And he used ganja as a sacrament, and he smoked like a quarter pound of it a day. Or so I have been led to understand. But yeah, it's really just not my genre of music. And so I'm just moving on to Ethiopian Fake Tig's next question. He says, why do you think about the idea that Nirvana is here and now and not about the future, and that the Buddha hates the idea of hope because hope implies not thinking about the present and about the future? I thought about how if you're in Nirvana, you're in the present moment fully and everything is perfect, and there's only thoughts of the past, of potential future that makes people fear and feel uncertain. So they make up gods whom they think they can appease to grant them a good future. So I'm not exactly what the question is here. Why do you think about the idea? I think Ethiopian Fake Tig means, what do you think about the idea that Nirvana is here and now and not about the future, and that the Buddha hates the idea of hope because hope implies not thinking about the present and about the future. Well, first I'd say the Buddha doesn't hate anything. So he doesn't hate the idea of hope. I mean, he just points out that hope is counterproductive for anyone who wants to be enlightened, because, of course, it's a kind of desire, and desire is the cause of all suffering. So the Buddha doesn't hate anything. He doesn't hate evil. He doesn't hate Mara. So let's see. That was just kind of a quibble. Let's get back to the actual question here. What do you think about the idea that Nirvana is here and now and not about the future? Well, I mean, technically you'd say that it's not even here and now. It's timeless and placeless. I mean, I'd hesitate to say it's pointless, but I mean, technically it is. I mean, time and space, those are like Kantian categories. It's just constructs of the mind. So, I mean, you transcend samsara, you're transcending time and space, essentially. But, I mean, you could say, yeah, I mean, from a samsaric point of view, an enlightened being would be more likely to be in the here and now. And when you're practicing like mindfulness, you try to be in the here and now, so that even if you're thinking about the future, you're mindful of now I'm thinking about the future, or just now are thoughts about the future. Now is thinking about the future. You don't want to be including a lot of I and ego stuff. But even if you're thinking about the future, if you're being really mindful, then it's right now there is thinking about the future. So you're detaching from the content really and just seeing it as a kind of phenomenon that is happening now. So Nirvana, I mean, from a samsaric point of view, it would be certainly more correct to say it's here and now than to say it's, somewhere else and some other time in the future or the past. Like Ram Dass used to say, be here now. But I'm not exactly sure. I mean, what do I think about the idea? Well, I guess I already said what I think about the idea, didn't I? So let's see, is there anything else to comment upon? Let's see here. It says, I thought about how if you're in Nirvana, you're in the present moment fully, sort of, and everything is perfect. Well, I mean, just because you're in the present moment doesn't mean necessarily that everything is perfect. I mean, animals tend to be in the present moment, but they still suffer. So, I mean, some suffering is just kind of like a reflex. It's just automatic, I guess. So that's kind of maybe a quibble. See, only thoughts of the past or potential future that makes people fear and feel uncertain. So they make up gods. Well, not necessarily. I mean, you can still be in the present moment and still suffer, I think. It's just, there's going to be way less cause for it. Because most suffering, especially like in the developed West, it's just kind of imaginary stuff. I don't have a good enough car, or, it's like, I like this girl and she doesn't like me, and this kind of thing, where you're just creating the problem just through like ignorance and delusion and just habit. The karma is like the habitual part of it. At least the making of new karma is the habitual part of it. So, yeah, I think it is possible that you can be in the present moment and still see things as imperfect, but No. All right. At like an animal level, they're pretty much stuck in the present moment. I mean, it's animals that aren't really super intelligent anyway, but still there's like this kind of an instinctive consideration of the future or something, you know. But gosh, where was I going with that? See, everything is perfect and it's only thoughts. I mean, Eckhart Tolle thinks almost all animals are enlightened, partly because of this very reason, because they're always in the power of now. You know, they're not thinking about the future or of the past or anything. Let's see. Yeah, I was going to say something really profound too, I bet. Let's see. Thoughts of the past and potential future that makes people fear and feel uncertain. So they make up gods whom they think they can appease to grant them a good future. Yeah, well, there's a lot of that. I think in the Dhammapada, it says for most people, religion is based on fear. You know, they worship gods just to, you know, make sure that the weather is good and, you know, that nothing really bad happens to them. They'll fend off diseases and so forth for themselves and their family. Okay. Yeah, I just lost that thought that I was going to follow up on, but see, hope implies not thinking about the present and about the future. I thought about how if you're in Nirvana, you're in the present moment fully. Yeah, I suppose. I mean, if you're being perfectly mindful, then yeah, even if you're thinking about the future or thinking about the past, you're thinking about the future now and you're thinking about the past now. So still, like an enlightened sage presumably can still think about the future. I mean, the Buddha talks about the future a lot. Not as much as he talks about the present, but still, he does. He talks about the past sometimes, like the whole Jataka genre is the Buddha talking about the past, but still he's doing it now, like mindfully now. Yeah, I guess I'm just going to have to move on to the next question because there's this thought. I can just sit here trying to remember what I was going to say for 5 minutes, but I don't think people are going to want to see or hear that. So I'm just moving on to Ethiopian Fake Tig's next question. And he says, I was thinking about nihilism and nirvana and realized that you can't have a crisis of meaning if you're in the present. If you admire a flower now and you love it now, the fact that it will die in the future is confusion because you're worried about the future, but fully in the present moment, you don't ask, what does this great piece of pie mean as you bite into it and it tastes great? Thoughts on this? Oh yeah, that reminds me of what Krishnamurti was saying. That's what I was going to say with regard to the last one, that Krishnamurti says, I mean, even if you're using language, still you're relying on the past. You're not fully in the present moment, even if you're thinking in words, because you're having to remember these words that you learned long ago in order to address what presumably you're dealing with now, but there's already like this delay, this lapse. So you're not fully in the present moment so long as you're thinking in words or having any kind of like ideas about anything, really. So nihilism and nirvana, I mean, you can still sort of have nihilism in the present moment. It's just everything is meaningless. I mean, unless you really take Krishnamurti to heart, and then if you're just even thinking in words, you're no longer in the present moment because the words have to be retrieved from memory to use them. And the memory is from the past. So, let's see, if you admire a flower now and you love it now, the fact that it will die in the future is confusion because you're worried about the future. Yeah, that's true. Yeah, you get attached to anything. I mean, it's like you want more of it. You want to keep experiencing it. And you can feel insecurity, like maybe I'm going to lose this, that kind of thing. So yeah, most suffering, at least most of it, is based on not being in the present moment and worrying about the future or worrying about the past, regret, remorse about the past, just inventing imaginary scenarios that might possibly come to pass, but even probably won't. That kind of thing is just self-inflicted suffering. So, I mean, if you are in the present moment, being mindful, it's still going to hurt when you stub your toe, and there's still going to be like animal instincts and reflexes that are going to cause you to kind of have aversion for that you have to be really advanced, that you're able to denature just the reflexive instinctive aversion for the pain. Just by being through mindful detachment. Pain is arising. You're just like this passive observer of this pain arising, which isn't the same as suffering, because the suffering is the desire for the pain to stop. And I should just move on to the next question. This is from Siddhartha Lohachita. And he says, he's baiting me with a political question here, I think. He says, because I've already answered this question before. He says, do you think universal suffrage, or voting for everyone, should be a political right? And if not, what would you propose instead? Well, of course, universal suffrage would be a disaster. And the founding fathers of the United States, at least some of them, including Thomas Jefferson, realized this and wrote about it, that when you have, every citizen even having the right to vote, not just like illegal aliens or even like people legally visiting America, they've got like a visa, they're not a full citizen yet. This is what the Democrats apparently want, at least a lot of them. They want even illegal aliens to be able to vote. But just as a start, just a step in the right direction would be to have a law, which probably will never be passed, that anyone living on welfare handouts should not have the right to vote. You forfeit your right to vote by like being a parasite on the economy. Because like Thomas Jefferson pointed out, when people like the proletariat, not even the proletariat as the workers, but the people who are like living on welfare handouts, when they realize they can just vote for free stuff, which isn't really free, it's free for them, but the taxpayers have to pay for it, then you just have like this downhill toboggan ride for the nation and the economy. So, yeah, as a good preventative of that, have only people who are productive in America, like law-abiding citizens who are contributing to the prosperity and economy, not living off of it, but contributing to it, that have the right to vote. And then after we get that, which is probably never going to happen without some just radical upheaval and just like a whole new system installed, then we can deprive women of the right to vote also. Because giving women the right to vote was like the beginning of the end for Western civilization. Women are more insecure as a general rule than men are. There is physical and psychological sexual dimorphism in the human species. Women desire security more than men do. In fact, women have this tendency of wanting to vote away rights and liberties for the sake of increased security. So you wind up with this socialist mommy state, which has pretty much taken over Europe, at least Western Europe. And with lots of like Ursula von der Leyen is like the leader of the EU right now, supposedly. A childless mother or childless woman. Angela Merkel before her, she messed up Europe worse than anybody before or since a certain German chancellor in the 1930s and early 40s. Even admirers of Hitler have to admit that, Hitler's expansionism did result in a huge backlash. Also, his dislike of Hebrews contributed to this huge backlash that just devastated Europe. So, yeah, I think what would I propose instead of universal suffrage? I think what the founding fathers of the United States had in mind and what was originally in place in America was not a bad idea. They wanted just like white Christian men who own property to be able to vote. And the white Christian part, I don't think is all that important. But like people who have a certain minimum amount of property and like real, like investment in the prosperity of the country, and have some education maybe. I mean, you should be able to know, you should have to know something about politics and economics before making, even voting on important decisions, which is another reason why women don't do as well as men statistically with regard to their voting records, because, I mean, studies have shown that women are less informed with regard to politics, current events, and economics than men are, even though women vote more than men do. So we have this gradual slide into a socialist mommy state. Partly because they just don't understand how economics works. So, yeah, I'd have male law-abiding citizens who are contributing to society. In fact, you could even go so far as to have only like a pater familias who is like the head of a household should have the right to vote, because you've got childless people nowadays, lots and lots of them, including female politicians who, I mean, it's like they don't care if society just toboggans into a quagmire, because they don't have children that are going to have to face it. You know, after me, the deluge. So it could be like an improvement of just the pater familias, just the male head of a household. Maybe you have to have a requirement for it to have at least one child, unless you can prove that you're incapable of it just through some physical mishap. You'd have a much stronger country. I mean, maybe certain rights and freedoms would become less, maybe they'd become more. It's hard to say with regard to that. But you wouldn't have as much of a welfare state. You'd have more reliance on private charity, which is much more spiritual. Private charity, where you've got like church groups and so forth that are like taking care of the poor. It's not perfect, but then obviously socialism isn't perfect either. And if it's private charity, it's not the government who's supporting like the welfare class, which is just burgeoning, because it's living off welfare has become like a career choice for tens of millions of people in America. I mean, that's just even citizens. That's not even including what I saw in the news earlier today, that at least 90% of all Somalians with children in America, like Somalian immigrants, are living off welfare to some degree. They're getting checks from the government. I mean, that's just ridiculous. And a lot of them are voting. Some of them are illegal aliens who are still voting. So, I mean, Western civilization is, I mean, it's just self-destructive at this point, largely due to a surplus of feminine sentiment and just ignorance of how politics and governments and economics and all that, how it all works. Let's just base everything on unrefined feminine sentiment. So, yeah, I mean, at the very least, people living on welfare handouts, unless, they've already made their contribution to society, are like elderly or like injured, and, they're living on a pension, that kind of thing, I'd say they can still vote. But people who are just either too lazy or too stupid to make a living, just make bad life decisions. I mean, they shouldn't be making decisions for everybody else and just voting for more and more free stuff, just voting in as much socialism as possible. And then after that, maybe you can think about restricting female suffrage and all that. But I'm just moving on to the next question here. And this is from Stellar Supreme and so on and so forth, et cetera, et cetera. And Stellar Supreme and so on and so forth, et cetera, says, would Christian prayers involving more Buddhist themes like filth of the body, corpse contemplation, and lordly deceiver manipulating worldly creations of men, condemnation of self-regard and personal view, be more skillful than normie conventions of prayer, even if they hit the appetite funny for squeamish people before meals? Well, I mean, Stellar Supreme and so on and so forth, et cetera, apparently hasn't read a whole lot of like Catholic like, the Imitation of Christ or the writings of St. John of the Cross, that sort of thing. The lordly deceiver manipulating worldly creations of men. In Christianity, that's called Satan. The three enemies to like the Catholic contemplative saint, the world, the flesh, and the devil. And the devil, he's in there. He gets a little bit more emphasis even than Mara does in Buddhism, I think. At least the old-fashioned kind of Christianity. Parents would make their children behave through threats of the devil. So, let's see, filth of the body, corpse contemplation. Corpse contemplation, not so much, I suppose. But the Christians have this idea. Like the saintly old-fashioned ones, they had this idea, you only get one chance. In Buddhism, you get like an infinite number of chances because you just keep getting reborn until you get it right. It's like Groundhog Day. But for a Christian, you just get this one life of a few decades, relatively speaking, that's going to determine whether you are rewarded in heaven or punished in hell forever and ever. So that kind of belief really spurred on a lot of like Christian saints to be very saintly. But let's see here. Filth of the body. Yeah, well, someone like, what was his name? Heinrich Suso. Yeah, some of those medieval Catholic saintly types, I don't think Suso was canonized. He was beatified, I think. They were literally filthy. That he wouldn't bathe. He was just covered with like fleas and bed bugs and lice and stuff. Well, I guess you don't get covered with bed bugs, but you get covered with lice, and he was covered with them. So, see, condemnation of self-regard. Yeah, that's all found in like Roman Catholic contemplative orders anyway. It's advanced practice that most of the normie Christians don't do. But most normie Buddhists, some Burmese villager, they're not contemplating filth of the body and corpse contemplations and like condemnation of self-regard and so forth. Because they're normies. They're just average people. They're just making a living and providing for their family and all that. They're not really going for like perfection or anything. And most Buddhists are the same way. So it's really not so different. Christianity in the modern West and the postmodern West has just become more and more degenerate, just as Theravada Buddhism in the postmodern West is just radically degenerate over, what you see in the texts anyway. So it's really not so different. Christian prayers involving more Buddhist themes be more skillful? That kind of stuff is already in there. It's just that most Christians don't pay much heed to that, just as most Christians don't pay much heed to gather not up your treasures upon the earth. Give no thought for tomorrow, what you will eat or where you will sleep, that kind of thing. The practice part of advanced Christianity and advanced Buddhism are very similar. It's just the narrative, like the theory is quite different. But the practice part is very similar. It's just that most average Christians and most average Buddhists, they're more concerned with just making a living, eating good food for dinner, making sure their kids don't get sick, that kind of stuff. And they're not thinking about this really advanced corpse contemplation stuff. That works on both sides. It's just some Western Buddhists are, they're kind of monastic anyway. They're attracted to that. And, they kind of emphasize that kind of stuff. And there are some Christians that are like that too, I suppose, that are still lay people, but still they're, they really emulate the more advanced teachings. But for the most part, your average secular Buddhist and your average secular Christian, they're more concerned with secular stuff anyway. But the Christians do have that stuff built into the system. It's just they don't pay much heed to it, which is just human nature. And so I'm just going to move on to the last question, the very last one. This is from Cherzaskaziz. And this came up earlier today when we were discussing on the Discord server, Ajahn Brahm and his pretty much unilateral attempts to get a Bhikkhuni Sangha going. So that, his attempts were kind of unscrupulous and just flouting rules and traditions and so forth. So he got himself booted out of the Ajahn Chah tradition, even though there are some like female feminist kind of Buddhists who think he's enlightened because of his efforts for, female equality and so forth. But anyway, Terzaskazis says, was ever any topic on which the majority of monks did agree on? And yeah, quite a few actually. It's like, if you have a great council, then, like the first council, second council, you have representatives of different like local sanghas all going to represent their local sanghas at this great council. You can't have all the Buddhist monks in the world attending a council, any kind of decision-making process, but at least they're sending a representative. And again, it's like the majority of monks, they may not agree at first, like with regard to the second council, where you have this big debate going on mainly, according to the Theravada Buddhist tradition representing what happened, the main issue was whether monks are allowed to handle money. And it just came up no, because obviously the Buddha didn't allow it as found in the rules of monastic discipline. And so at the beginning, you had monks that were arguing the other way, but they all agreed at the end, okay, the no money people win the argument. We consent to that. Let's all recite the Patimokkha together. And the majority of monks, even now, the majority of monks agree on like the contents of the Tipitaka, for example. There may be quibbling over like punctuation marks or a word here and there, that kind of thing. What exactly, like the Burmese include a few texts that other Buddhist countries don't include into their canonical Tipitaka, like the Milinda Panya is considered canonical in Burma, not considered canonical anywhere else that I know of. You got a few others like the Neti Pakarana, just obscure commentarial works, sort of like the Padisambhita Magga, that are considered canonical, even though like the Sri Lankans and the Thais don't consider them canonical, but still most of it they agree on. Just with regard to a lot of things, the majority of monks agree on, like the fact that the Bhikkhuni order no longer exists. Most of the monks in existence would agree on that, because most of the monks in existence are relatively conservative Asians. So most of the Sangha of the Four Quarters would agree the Bhikkhuni order does not exist, and these women calling themselves Bhikkhunis and being promoted by people like Ajahn Brahm, it's just fake. You could argue that these women calling themselves bhikkhunis now, they're wearing the robes by theft, calling themselves ordained when really they're not. In which case, even if the Bhikkhuni order was revived, like through a great council, the decree of a great council, which probably isn't going to happen, still they could be barred from ever being ordained because they've already been wearing the robes by theft, which disqualifies someone from being really ordained. If you're like pretending to be a monk, for example, a bhikkhu, you're wearing the robes and just, living at the monastery, pretending that you were ordained when you really weren't, then that's it. You're barred from ever being ordained because, that disqualifies you. So, yeah, again, the question, was there any topic on which the majority of monks did agree on? Yeah, of course there was. There's lots of them. In fact, most of the established tradition of Theravada Burma now is agreed on by the vast majority of monks. There's always going to be a few outliers. Like Four Noble Truths, pretty much everyone agrees on that. And the Four Noble Truths are rather important. So, yeah, the answer to that is yeah. And I guess I'm done. So, as I should always say at the beginning, and pretty much never do, if you have any questions you think maybe I can answer, especially with regard to early Buddhism, Theravada Buddhism, Buddhist monasticism, it's kind of the history of Buddhism, not necessarily Bob Marley. I don't really know anything about him, or very much anyway. Meditation, that kind of stuff, then feel free to ask the question and I will attempt to answer it. Just include it in the comments below this video, if you please. And like and subscribe. Look at the URL links and be happy. And I'm going to stop recording now.